it always means that the source code is available. That's the most important overarching thing, and that's what causes people to refer to these colloquially as open source, because they have access to the source code. But the license is not unrestricted, and it has what licensing lawyers would call a field of use limitation. It can also be number of users or something like that too, but it's usually a field of use limitation. A field of use limitation is an old term in IP licensing, and it can refer to, say, a technology area, a market, a geography, or a kind of use. The thing about source available licenses that makes them look a lot like open source licenses is that they're implemented in what I would call a frictionless manner. So if you look at if it's fair to call anything in the software world traditional, at a traditional license, like an end user license, you have to click to accept it. And there are legal underpinnings for why that's a best practice in end user licensing. Source available doesn't have an acceptance mechanism, at least it very rarely does. So it's implemented like open source licenses, meaning you usually download the software and there's a license included in the software. Same way you would find out what the license was for open source software. So you usually don't have to click to accept anything, but the license grants broad enough rights so that if you don't accept the terms and you reject them, then you wouldn't really have the right to do what you wanted to do with the software. That's the legal theory on which frictionless method rests. So just to recap, source available, like open source, it makes source code available. Unlike open source, it has a license restriction, and like open source, it's deployed in a frictionless manner. So here are some examples of source available licenses that you might have heard of. The most popular one is the business source license, which was created by MariaDB. And it's been around for a long time. It's an unusual one because it includes this license change notice, license change feature or bug, depending on how you look at it. And so what it says is you can use the software for non-production uses, which, by the way, is not defined. And then it says automatically after a certain amount of time, maximum 4 years, the license changes to a GPL compatible open source license. So this is sometimes referred to as embargo or delayed open source. The business source license has gotten a lot of traction, particularly in the crypto area. And there's no particular reason why it was in the crypto area other than just it was adopted by some companies in that area. And so it, got a little bit of publicity and popularity. The thing is that the production use restriction is really kind of broad and not precise enough for most people. And so they tend to write what they call additional use grants. So with business source license, you're usually looking at the business source license itself and an additional use grant. And then it selects the change license, which can be, say, GPL or BSD, MIT, LGPL. And then it selects a change date. That's the most complicated one. And weirdly, it's the most common one. But that tells you something about how licensing works. Sometimes people adopt licenses because they've heard of them and maybe not because they're necessarily the easiest to understand or even the best one to use. There's the Elastic license. That was, of course, published by Elasticsearch. And that is was sometimes referred to as an Amazon killer. I think that's a reductive way to look at it, but it says you can't use the software to provide a managed or hosted service. So this type of restriction is very popular in source available licenses because the companies that release software under these licenses are trying to protect their cloud business. Elastic, the Elastic license allows redistribution freely. So it's not protecting the distribution business, only the cloud business. So that's a strategic decision. Elastic also has another restriction, which is that you can't disable the license key functionality because Elastic controls some of its paid features by putting them in the software, but having them not be turned on unless you paid for them. So I would say that like Business Source was predated a lot of these other licenses by quite a bit. Elastic is one of the more recent ones. And and then in between those two is Commons Clause. I would say Commons Clause ended up being more like a thought experiment than something that a lot of people use. It's actually a kind of an addendum to an open source license. And the fact that it was an addendum caused some consternation in the open source world. But it's like, here, this software is under Apache, but we're putting Commons Clause on it. And it basically says you can't sell the licensed software. So at a very high level, I would describe that as a non-commercial restriction, which is kind of more like Business Source license. So if you see Commons Clause, you'll see the base license plus the addition of Commons Clause. Polyform is a project that I worked on with some other lawyers who are in the open source space to create a kind of Creative Commons-like menu of choices for source available licenses. And so if you look at Polyform, you would see various choices like non-commercial, evaluation only, and even some that are kind of similar to Elastic type of restriction. So these are some of the most common ones you'll see. And I'll reiterate, they're not open source licenses, but from a 50,000 foot view, they can kind of look like open source licenses. But when you see them in software with Business Source license, you're going to see the license plus some additional information, the change license, the change date, etc., and probably an additional use grant. With Elastic, you'll just see the license, just like you would with an open source license. With Commons Clause, you would see the base open source license plus Commons Clause. And with Polyform, you would, again, just see the base license because that's just one document.